big, tremendous. It's gotta be big.
Huge.
It's gotta be huge.
Hello and welcome to this week's Life of the Party, a deep dive into everything to do with your party, the Green Party, a New Left Party, whichever party we all end up being a part of. I'm your host, Todd, and I'm here with my friends and comrades, Shanice, McBean.
I am both a comrade and a comrade, and hello.
That's not even that's not even how they. It's not even the confusion you usually have with comrades, right? Usually it's comrades or comrades. No, what's a comrade?
With my comrades, Shanice McBean, and my comrades, Jonas, Marvin.
I'm gonna get rid of you in a sec.
I could do this all day.
You're gonna run out of vowels soon.
No, mate, I got vowels for days. Welcome to Life of the Party. Announcements for this week. We are going to be at Norwich Transformed. Norwich Transformed is happening. It's happening on a Saturday in May, 16th of May. This is going to be 5 days before my birthday. So if you come, it's like a little
one day
gift
before
for me.
Mine. 1
day before Jonas. Basically, we're going to be celebrating our birthdays at Norwich Transformed, where we're doing 2 panels. Jonas is doing 3 panels because he's keen. He's very keen. Tickets are 5 to 20 quid. You can find it on Eventbrite. Just search Norwich Transformed 2026 on Eventbrite. We will see you there, East of England comrades. It'll be flat because that bit of England is flat. And I grew up in Yorkshire and I find that weird. Moving on.
Just a fun fact before we move on.
Oh, is it? Fun fact, yeah?
Oh,
yeah. You know what I'm going to say, don't you?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're going to say, bro.
I have no idea. What are you going to say?
So just a fun fact. Not only are we going to be in Norwich, but Norwich is the birthplace of Mr. Jonas Marvin himself.
That's right.
So I know he sounds like he's from London, and he is from London. He grew up there. I know he sounds cool and sounds like he's a proper bruv, but he's from Norwich.
I was born in Norwich. I blame my mum for that, and then she realised, and she sent me back to London very quickly in my youth.
Shanice, you can't be implying that Norwich is uncool when it's the first place we're going to be doing a podcast. Come on.
I'm not implying it's uncool at all. I'm just saying.
No, you didn't, Shanice.
Oh,
I did do that. Yeah, I did do that.
Yeah, you did. You'll feel the full wrath of Norwich Transformed when we get there. You know?
I'm pumped to be going back to the place of my birth. 34 years after the moment. Can't wait.
Anyway, this is as substantial a plug as Norwich Transformed could have ever hoped for. So let's move on to the news. Shanice, what have you got for us this week?
So the news for this week, I think, is really a tale of 2 parties and also a duality of the international and the national. So there's war and imperialism on the one hand, Trump and the US and its belligerents. And then in Britain, we've got the local elections on the other and kind of internal party machinations. And although these are kind of different spheres of politics, there are some ways that they interconnect, not least because the crisis of social reproduction is on its way to us due to the war in Iran. Cost of living crisis is going to escalate. Energy prices are going to escalate as global finance systems are disrupted by the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. And then that connects to the local context because our councils are tasked with administering and organising day-to-day social reproduction for its constituents. So there are these connections between kind of what's happening internationally and our local elections that are coming up in May. And then also it's connected because obviously people care about war, people care about what Israel's doing in the Middle East, and people care about opposing the belligerence of US imperialism. It does decide votes in this country. So Keir Starmer has come out of this week looking really shit, looking quite bad, to be honest. He's held on to this idea of a special relationship with the US and with Israel for far too long, and has often been kind of apologetic and really timid in his response to Israel's genocide and Israel's belligerence, and then obviously Trump, who's an increasingly unstable and unreliable human and ally to the British establishment. Despite that, though, he's actually being forced by the circumstances. So Trump cussing him out, Trump committing war crimes, Trump threatening genocide, Israel trying to obliterate Lebanon. He's being forced by these circumstances to distance himself from Trump and from Israel. So once again, he just looks like, you know, he's completely lacking in any principles, any cojones, you know. He's just grey and just lacking in character and a complete opportunist. By contrast, I mean, it's the right word, I think, cojones. He's got no balls. This guy's got no balls.
You can get away with it.
I am a long-standing Marxist feminist. By contrast, Zack Polanski and the Green Party have come out of this week swinging. So he's kind of described, Zack has described the word fascist as a watered down word for what Trump actually is. So not only is Zack Polanski looking good for having been right about Trump months ago and about Trump's direction of travel and the need for Britain to change its relationship to the US. So not only was he right, and not only has that given him something of, you know, a bit of a prime ministerial quality, the ability to kind of stand up to a bully like Trump and kind of lay down some principles. But he's also making ideological ground this week because he's doubled down on the idea of Trump as a fascist, and he's just taking ideological credibility away from the liberal and mainstream elite and political establishment. So we can turn from kind of Zack and look to your party and see what their response has been. So Jeremy Corbyn has been consistent as an anti-imperialist voice this week. He's laid it on thick about Britain's complicity and Starmer's hypocrisy, particularly with the genocide in Gaza and then the assaults on Iran and Lebanon. But he has been noticeably absent from the mainstream media cycle, certainly has had tons fewer appearances than Zack has. And I think that does speak to the reality that the Greens are going from strength to strength. And meanwhile, your party, and even Jeremy Corbyn and Corbynism more generally, is stuck in this kind of malaise and are being completely outflanked by the new shiny thing on the block. But while Zack Polanski has kind of been very outward-facing, sticking it to Trump and laying down kind of an anti-imperialist slant to his politics, your party has been much more concerned with the domestic sphere and its internal wranglings. So your party's external communications have been really focused on the kind of local elections that are upcoming. They've been pushing this idea of a left flank and a green alliance, but increasingly that's kind of looking like it's, you know, your party tailing the Greens as opposed to being able to add anything substantial or of substance to this supposed left flank or alliance. And they've also released a list of people, independent candidates, that they will be supporting in the local elections in May. But this list has ended up being one that contains ex-Tory councillors, people who have, from the evidence I've seen, included paid-up Tory members who were paid up until at least 2025, others 2022 or a little bit earlier, and also landlords, including landlords who appear to have really terrible records with their tenants. And this has therefore led to another internal implosion within your party, which has inevitably spilled out to the online sphere, centred on both the kind of poor sense of political decision-making and the secrecy of decision-making within your party's leadership. But frustratingly, it also comes after a week of really quite awful internal wrangling amongst CC members, rank and file members, Sam Gorst utterly embarrassing himself in the public sphere, absolute schmuck. And he's one of the key reasons I actually left your party last week. Compare and contrast that to the Green Party. Jonas is absolutely cackling here. Was it my use of the word schmuck? The Jewish influence on my life, my Jewish household and partner. But you compare and contrast that to the Greens, for example, who have been very much focused on opposing Trump, opposing US imperialism, opposing Israel this week. But where they have been focused on the May elections, it's been very outward-facing, very positive, very energetic. So the Greens did an emergency demonstration in Margate this week because there was a council by-election in Cliftonville, Kent, and the outcome of that has been amazing. The results came out and both Reform, Labour, Tory and the Lib Dem vote dropped and the Greens catapulted to victory there. Not only that, 200 of their council hopefuls have signed up to an anti-austerity pledge that commits them to an anti-austerity position if they make it into council positions. And they've committed to an emergency summit on the crisis of local party budgets that will be a collaboration with councillors in other parties and trade unions. So it's been a big week, both internationally and domestically. And one party is looking very outward, very poised, very energetic, capitalising on a humiliated Trump and a floundering Labour. And then another party is swinging from internal crisis to internal crisis, completely outflanked by the Greens, adding very little that is radical or even socialist to the map, and with a leadership team that feels ossified by its own inertia, with very little to offer, seemingly, other than washed-up Tory councillors and online rows. And that might be a little bit unfair because, you know, there are some candidates locally in your party who are doing great things. But if we're talking about the overall vibe in your party, it's just absolutely bleak. So that's my thoughts on this week, Jonas. What are you thinking?
Where do you begin? I guess I just want to say that, like, if like zooming out a little bit to them earlier questions about like empire and imperialism, I think it's so difficult at the minute to get a sense of what is actually happening. There's such a level of like boosterism and misinformation when it comes to like the global sphere of politics that it makes things quite difficult. But like the one thing that you probably could say is that like this ceasefire, however temporary it is, however kind of fluid the boundaries of the agreement are, it's like a huge tactical and strategic defeat for Trump and for Netanyahu. It may be just a short-term defeat, but it's a huge one nonetheless.
Definitely.
And I want to go into that context a little bit because I think the Iranian state's played a good game here strategically with that kind of clout over the Strait of Hormuz and also a bit of a propaganda blinder.
Yeah.
In the sense that like, you know, that this ceasefire has come, this ceasefire that they were pretty resistant to, by the sounds of things. And as the ceasefire is brought in, the Israeli state is still carrying out huge amounts of murderous violence in Lebanon. And I think like there's kind of just like a fundamental question here which shapes all of these conversations, which comes back to what you said in the last episode, which is that with the demise of American unipolarity, that you repeatedly find Trump and the American regime chasing its own tail, or chasing the tail of more aggressive allies, in this case, Israel and the Gulf states. And, you know, you say that with the context that, like, by the time that this episode is out, the ceasefire is over, right? Let's see. But, like, that's the kind of frequency we're moving at with politics, right? And it's just worth grounding that. Because if that's the frequency of politics, it requires a level of seriousness from our politicians and our political leaders. I mean, it's incredible. It's notable that Trump has been trying to pursue a ceasefire for weeks, had some success with the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Shehbaz Sharif, bridging the gap between the US and Israel. That's the official story. There's been some noise that China put a lot of pressure on Iran. China, who was still receiving vessels through the Strait of Hormuz whilst the war was ongoing. But it's incredible. Trump is openly talking of auditing NATO members and withdrawing troops from allied countries which hesitated in support of his war in Iran. Like, this is profound circumstances. And I think you could say that there's no left-wing politician in Britain, at least, speaking to the profound scale of this crisis and challenge. Zack Polanski comes closest. No question about that.
Yeah, because he's noticing the opportunities,
Exactly.
the ideological opportunities.
He's looking outwards. He's looking at the real world rather than inside his tent, right? Like, Trump will likely be gone in a couple of years. Like, MAGA certainly will not be. And so it really puts an onus on the left to work through what our agenda looks like in this moment, arguing for a new global order distinct from the sort of vanishing unipolar liberalism on the one hand, and then the sort of gunboat diplomacy of Trumpism on the other. There's a lot of work there to be fleshed out in terms of how you think about, well, what is the left's vision of a new global order? But I still think it requires, even if it should not be limited to, connecting the everyday impacts of this war on the cost of food, fuel, and lots of other things to the question of war making. a comrade and listener who I won't name has spoken of a cost of war crisis.
Yep.
And I think that's a really brilliant framing, and that the left should be making more of that. It's noticeable in Ireland that there have now been days of protests over fuel prices, politicized by the far right. Supermarkets are openly talking about introducing data to sustain dynamic pricing, and food price inflation could be 9-10% higher by June. Starmer told Robert Peston that he's fed up that the US president keeps doing things which raise consumer prices. All right, but what the fuck are you going to do about it,
Yeah,
you
exactly.
massive little melt?
And also, The Guardian reported that he didn't tell him that in person. So
Yeah,
he's just,
okay,
he's
well,
just
there you
been
go.
briefing it.
Yeah, exactly.
But he's not actually standing up
Yeah,
to the guy.
exactly. So this is the landscape we're operating in now, and we have to get ahead of it as much as possible, because alongside all the bloodshed and horror, if you have a look outwards, there are actual strategic opportunities here if the left is willing to take them. And to be fair, they can't all be left on the shoulders of Zack Polanski. And like, to this question, I think it's really good, really, to have that kind of framing, right? Of, what's Zack Polanski and the Greens doing here, and what are Corbyn and your party doing here, and how much of a significant contrast is that, right? It's a really, really important point to make. And I don't know, I think you've not said it already, right? But like neither of us now are members of your party.
I didn't want to bait you out, but
and like,
we have both left.
because it just doesn't seem like a serious outfit. And I think in the next episode, we're going to have a much more deep dive conversation about why your party hasn't worked. And I kind of relish that conversation. But I think there's one fundamental thing here, which might be a surprise to people, which is that when you look at the difference between Zack Polanski's Greens and Corbyn's Your Party, one of the things that really stands out to me, beyond all of the embarrassing stuff, right? I mean, and there's lots of embarrassing stuff. I mean, there is all of these mayors in Oldham, Walsall, and ever constituted of landlords who have been put up as councillors that your party will support, as candidates as your party will support, and then being taken off once they get loads of flack for it. I mean, in Stoke, where I live, they put up a candidate who I've not heard of, and lots of activists and people in the community haven't heard of in the ward next to me, to stand in the constituency. I live in Stoke-on-Trent, the city. There aren't elections in the city. They've stood a candidate in a place where there aren't elections. There are elections next door in Newcastle-under-Lyme Borough Council election.
That's crazy.
But they've stood a candidate in Hanley Park ward where there aren't elections. Like, it's madness.
That's embarrassing.
Like, they've
bro.
lost the plot. Like, what's going on? I need to recheck the list, because he's probably not, or they are probably off the list now. I won't name the person. I don't know the person. I don't want to snipe up the person. I mean, it's a huge collective failure. But I think when we go back to that question of landlordism and the differences between Zack Polanski's Greens and Corbyn's Your Party, for me, there's a real difference, right? Which is, one has a fundamentally interesting and insightful and compelling and everyday sense of class that is felt and real and meaningful. Zack Polanski talks about rent controls, talks about fuel prices, talks about landlords, talks about the cost of living. And then you have a really limited anti-austerity politics with Corbynism, which talks about austerity, which talks about building more council housing. Two things that I fundamentally agree with Corbynism on, but cannot get beyond that.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a real problem. And look, I'll be honest, it's certainly the case, in my opinion, which might sound counterintuitive when we see the huge effort of Greens organising in getting hundreds of councillors and potential councillors in the Green Party to sign up to no austerity pledges, which I think is a brilliant bit of political work. So what I'm about to say may seem counterintuitive, but the Green Party are not prepared for the onslaught which might confront them when they're in office, right? Through no fault of their own. The broader working class isn't prepared. The social movements aren't prepared. There's none of the architecture, the infrastructure, the organisation to back it up. Maybe this can emerge a bit more spontaneously, but that's a question that we need to think about. But at least the Greens and Greens organisers are trying to find meaningful left answers and strategies to these questions in this moment, with these pledges to not implement austerity and to organise a conference around it and follow on that basis. Whereas you cannot say that of Corbyn and your party. They have a fundamentally outdated conception of class. They're not looking outwards. And as much as I admire and respect Corbyn's anti-imperialism and identify with it and share lots of its tenets, him and the people around him undermine it when they treat politics so unseriously.
Yep. And I think I'd add on to that and say that, there's a reason why I chose to use the word consistent when I described Jeremy Corbyn and energetic when I described Zack Polanski, because although Corbyn is very consistent in being against, the genocide in Gaza, being against the war in Iran, being against US belligerence, being against Keir Starmer idiocy and hypocrisy, he's just very bland
Keir
with
Starmer's
it.
an idiot.
Keir Starmer's a waste man, fam. He's such a waste man. And while Keir Starmer's a waste man, Corbyn's is he's just a bit dry these days. It's just like, it's hard to put my finger on it exactly politically as like a political critique. But it's kind of the way he does politics. It's the same old propagandistic formulations. United working class, black and white unite and fight, defend migrants, all things that are politically sound, but there's just no gusto behind it. There's no energy behind it. It doesn't feel like the formulations are modern and like ripe for our times, if that makes sense. And this is purely instinctual. This is just how I feel. It's not kind of like a big political critique. But there's just something very different in the tenor that Zack communicates in that means he can reach through and feels really relevant and feels really now that Corbyn just doesn't share. And connected to that, I really do think now is the time for bold ideas, bold politics, creative ideas, and radical pedagogy. I have always argued that it's the left's job to change hearts and minds and to, not be bound by this idea that where an electorate or where the population is at ideologically now is where they will always be, and that we simply need to appeal to where people are at. The reality is, though, that is harder in times of downturn, harder in times of defeat. As much as you might try to push a different narrative, whether it cuts through or not is beyond our control most of the time. That feels different now. The material conditions for big ideological shifts feel like they're starting to come together. The boundaries of global power are shifting, and with that, the ideological ballast that holds it together is crumbling. This idea of the immutable power of the US is being undermined. This idea of the unity of the West, this idea that the East are barbaric and the kind of West are the good guys. All of these things are crumbling, and with that, I think, come opportunities for us and the left materially to really break through with new ideas, a new vision for what we want the world to look like, how we want to organise ourselves. And I will just mention, with that in mind, I had the pleasure of being on Zack Polanski's podcast, Bold Politics, last week, and the response to the conversation that we had, which was on abolition, typically I'm told that abolition is a really unpopular idea and it has no truck with the British public. But the response has been incredible to the extent that I was sent a screenshot of a Labour Facebook group, a Labour Party Facebook group, talking about how they enjoyed and learnt from that conversation. And I don't want to extrapolate or, take too much from that, but I do think the time is ripe for us to really be thinking about how we break through with new ideas and kind of bolder politics and really thinking outside of the political orthodoxies that we're familiar with. And that's vital work. We need to break capitalist and imperialist realism. We need to break the back of the idea that the way the world is organised is the way the world must be organised, or the only way the world can be organised. And I think, the material conditions are changing to make that more real and more possible. One thing I do want to say about the Greens, and I was thinking this all week as they had another good week, both electorally, ideologically, politically, and in terms of kind of Zack doing the communication rounds. It occurred to me how much the Greens are relying on this idea of fresh faces and new people in politics. Zack is a very fresh face. He's very new. He has that sense of, okay, he's doing things differently. And I saw that Novara Media did an article on Zoe Garbett as well, who's going to be running for mayor in Hackney. And it was a similar kind of line. It's like, is Zoe the new kid on the block that we need that's going to change politics? And it struck me that narrative is so dangerous, actually, because it convinces people that the problem with politics is the wrong people as opposed to the wrong system. If only we just have different people in these places of power, if only we just have the right politics, then things would be better. And that is partly true. You need people who are willing to be bold and take risks in a left-wing direction in places of power. That's true. But fundamentally, the problem is the system. Fundamentally, the problem is capitalism. It's the way we organise ourselves. It's the way we organise politics, democracy, economics. And I think without a really strong narrative that simply being in office isn't enough, and without real strong political organisation, both at the grassroots level, at the institutional level, and at the political level, that the Greens need to do in order to prepare for taking office, I think that could be really dangerous for us on the left in general, because we could have these kind of new people in power. We could try the Greens out. It could be an absolute failure. And what that communicates to people is, well, not even the Greens can give us a better life. So maybe let's just go straight to barbarism, which is the risk, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think I can't talk about it right now because it's not public information yet. But in the next episode, I think it's be really good to kind of talk a little bit more about the Greens are going to do elections. They're doing well, with this kind of pledges against austerity and councils thing of trying to test the limits of what you can do within an electoral thing, I think, for now. But it's important to ask the question, which we will do in the next episode, about, well, what do all these people who are no longer in your party or no longer engaged with your party do, right? And how does that start to do the other bit, which is how do you build up? How do you take the question of power seriously?
Yeah, exactly.
Which we need to be doing much more. Not because in 2029 you're going to have a big, shiny green government led by Zack Polanski that's going to try and introduce socialism, and then you're going to have a workers' movement that backs it, but because you need to have a political movement, a social movement with social leverage, with muscle, that can actually exercise gains and win things.
And hold those in power to account at all levels of society.
Our own people as well.
Exactly.
Crucially. So yeah, that would be crucial in the next episode. Because it's like when you observe from afar, that kind of jealous feeling you have from afar watching the New York mayoralty, right? With Zoran Mamdani and all of the people around him. And if you're a nerd like I am, you read all of these puff pieces, these ideological profiles that go deep into the minds of the people that he has as housing minister, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's really, really interesting. And it's really useful, actually, to get a sense of how those people tick, like what kind of policies they're interested, what their game plan is, like what the strategy is, all of that sort of stuff. But those people, half the time, will tell you themselves that none of this means anything if we don't have countervailing forms of power to back it up, right? Which is really important. We've talked a lot on the podcast about how the key thing for the left, and this follows from what we've been saying, is like, for those bits of the left that aren't going to join the Greens, how do you occupy that space that's being cleaved open by Zack Polanski's Greens and kind of push it? And the great thing about Zack Polanski is he's pretty open about people being able to do that, right? That's why the Bold Politics episode was so good, right? Because you guys going on there and talking about the prison system, talking about abolition, talking about racialized capitalism, right? Talking about all of these different forms of domination and oppression in very serious, meticulous ways, grounded in reality, that are compelling and that can convince people of a broader anti-systemic agenda, is just really important.
Yeah.
And it's precisely some of the work, even though going on the podcast isn't the be all end all of political activity, right? We both know that as podcasters, but it's really important that there is that kind of dialectic, that dynamic between the left of the Greens and the Greens, where people are trying to occupy those spaces and stretch the arguments. And this may change, right? The closer that the Greens get to power, and that parts of the Greens are quite open to that and open to holding that space open. I think when it comes to Corbyn, we're going to talk a little bit about what, living through decades of defeat does to someone's politics later on in the show, right? But I guess the fundamental thing for me is the question of labourism. And it feels counterintuitive to say that because Corbyn's politics are so contingent on his anti-imperialism, and his anti-imperialism in so many ways is so brilliant and so solid. And I still, on that front, have an enormous respect for him, for how he's held the line on anti-imperialism over all of the years. And it would be wrong to just say that the rest of Corbyn's politics are kind of classically labourist. You just pull the lever of the big state machine and you implement all of these policies through the state. He comes from a generation of kind of the new left that went into the Labour Party. And, he went to Michael Manley's government in Jamaica, right?
Yeah.
And like that he was interested in these experiences of like anti-imperialism in the global south or elsewhere in the world, taking them seriously and connecting them to radicalism here in Britain. But somewhere down the line, I think that domestic politics has become a bit more congealed into a kind of labourism, and it's been held back by a labourism and an attachment to labourism. That means it's too reliant on the state as an agent and as a vehicle of leverage, and not reliant enough. Even though Corbyn will go to loads of demonstrations, he's interested in community organising, he's interested in class struggle, he's interested in building up people's capacity. It relies too much on a kind of 20th century vision of social democracy that doesn't fit in today's world, and that we have to interrogate a lot more, frankly, if we're going to be able to do well as the radical left in this kind of historic moment.
Yeah, and I think what you just said just explains so well both why your party has chosen an electoral strategy, but also why it's just not hitting very well.
Okay, thanks so much for that, guys. I thought that was really, really interesting conversation. Okay, and now for today's hot take. So, Jonas, I think you've got the hot take this week. What have you got for us?
Yeah, so before I go into my hot take, Shanice, you were in London for the Together March. Why don't you give us a little bit of a vibe check?
Yeah, so the Together March was really big and really vibrant, to be honest. So it happened a few weeks ago, 28th of March, and the organisers put it at 500,000. The Metropolitan Police admitted that it was difficult to estimate how many people were there. They put it at 50,000, but to be honest, I think it was well over that. And regardless of what the official number is, there's absolutely no denying that at the very, very least, it rivaled, and I think most likely exceeded, the numbers at the Unite the Kingdom march last year.
Oh, definitely.
Like, without a doubt. And there was lots of dancing, lots of vibes. It's very, very multi-ethnic. I think, a really vibes showing of unity and solidarity. It's very rare that we get marches these days that kind of shut down London from every direction. They were 10 a penny in the 2010s, and they're much harder to come by these days. And the Together March did do that. So I think for me, it kind of put a dent in the insurgency that we felt from 2024 racist riots, the rise of reform, the Unite the Kingdom march last year, and it put a dent in that insurgency. And I think it kind of chimes with the rise of the Greens and this new polarity that we've got between the kind of Greens and reform, between the left and the right, and the death of the centre, the death of the liberal establishment. So yeah, it was vibes. It was, I think, much better than I would have anticipated it would be.
Yeah, like I got a lot of reports from friends, and I think this is like the biggest tell for any demonstration is that how fast can you walk? How much
Exactly.
can you move? And everyone was telling me like,
you're a sardine.
Yeah, I could barely budge. Like, and I think that's really important because many of you will have taken part in a Together March. There were many thousands of people attendant on it, and far be it for me to turn my nose up at any mobilization of 500,000 against racism. I mean, possibly the biggest, absolutely, definitely the biggest mobilization against racism in the history of this country in terms of size.
Because biggest single mobilization.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Because it was, I definitely think it was in the region of 500,000. And like I was jealous. Like I was sat on Instagram watching reels of the marching and the dancing, and just wishing I was with everyone and wishing I was with all of you. And frankly, the organisers, some of whom we're going to talk a little bit about now, should be incredibly proud. But we did want to use the opportunity of this march to have a bit of a frank conversation. This is Life of the Party. That's what we do. About one particular component central to the organising of this march, and that is the Socialist Workers Party. The Socialist Workers Party was born out of an attempt to refresh renew in some instances to look past Trotskyism. I'm going to unpack this. Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, the leader of the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, one of the architects of the Bolshevik Revolution, was eventually exiled and assassinated by Joseph Stalin's Soviet regime. Unlike the communist parties that identified with the Soviet Union, despite its kind of turn away from emancipatory politics in the late 20s and 30s, there have been very few mass Trotskyist parties. The SWP, or its earlier moniker, the International Socialists, sometimes joked that they were the smallest mass party in the world, building and in some respects breaking from Trotsky's legacy and his kind of critique of the bureaucratization of the Russian Revolution. The International Socialists defined themselves by the explanation that you could diagnose the Soviet Union as state capitalist, and rather than communist, or rather than a degenerated workers' state, which was pervasive amongst kind of orthodox Trotskyists. And they also argue that the left after the Second World War wasn't in revolutionary times at all. The Trotsky had kind of predicted the dying catastrophe of capitalism after the Second World War. And they kind of argued that this was wrong. Instead, what you saw is that a kind of permanent arms economy was absorbing and renewing capital's losses at a resounding rate. And this provided the basis for post-war social democracy. So after an initial quite libertarian phase, the IS became the SWP, the Socialist Workers Party, and it came to see itself in the 70s, particularly as it grew in the thousands, and it developed some roots in rank and file workers' struggles, as a political party capable of mass work. In this respect, it became central to both Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League, both organizations that can take some meaningful credit for defeating the National Front and making Britain less racist. Darkest How, the kind of famous anti-racist Black Power activist and broadcaster, talked about, of his 5 children, the first 4 grew up in a kind of furious struggle against racism, but the 5th of his children grew up relatively black at ease, he says. Those were his words. So an interesting kind of contrast there. And he gives responsibility for that to David Wedgery and Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League. So in this combination, I don't want to dismiss some of the important stuff that's there. The SWP also, decades later, even as it shrunk in size and political originality and a healthy culture, and struggled to cope with the defeats of Thatcherism, would become a central pivot behind Unite Against Fascism, a coalition which played a big role in the fights against the English Defence League, and before that, the British National Party, led by Nick Griffin. And before that, it would be the central cog in the Stop the War coalition, which would mobilize millions against the war in Iraq. Now, I joyously anticipate the kind of lefty train spotting nerds pulling me up on anything I've got wrong there. Can't wait for that. But we'll ask ourselves, why is any of this relevant? Well, I want to argue that the Socialist Workers Party's toxic internal culture, its ongoing strategic orientation, and its way of doing politics is what happens when your organization isn't meaningfully rooted in the class, isn't properly democratic, and isn't trying to work through the challenges of politics today. And we as leftists who have this experience right in front of our eyes should heed this lesson as we develop politics and organizations fit to our own times. We've talked about this before. I think we talked about this in our kind of listener question episodes around the Christmas period. But me and Shanice were both, for our sins, once members of the Socialist Workers Party. We left the organization because a leading member was responsible for sexual harassment and assault against 2 female comrades. The accused member, once the SWP's national secretary, was defended by his friends on the Central Committee, by hundreds of members who signed letters in support, who vilified the survivors, who framed the largely young but not exclusively student members who had rose up in opposition at these developments as, and I quote, movementists and autonomists who couldn't cope with the defeat of the student movement in 2010, and so had subsequently abandoned the working class as the central agent of change. These are kind of the stories that were told at the time. Obviously, this was a horribly traumatic time for all of us involved, particularly the female comrades at the center of it, who were asked just the most disgusting questions about their drinking habits, about their political fidelity, by a disputes committee that was populated by a significant amount of people who that weren't only comrades of the accused, but also close friends. Eventually, once the leadership had accepted the demands of the opposition faction around the question of how cases like this would be handled, without, of course, accepting any of the responsibility and putting responsibility at the feet of the door of those who were standing on basic feminist principles, hundreds left the organization afterwards. Now, there are lots of reasons this happened. Chief among them, sexism and misogyny, is obviously quite high. A poor, outdated account within the organization of how sexual violence manifests itself, also pretty high. I remember Shanice at the time writing some very powerful stuff about how the organization had miserably failed on these questions. But I think a central feature is that here you have an organization that grew and developed in periods of mass militancy on the streets and in workplaces. Big strikes that brought down Tory governments, big anti-fascist movements, big feminist movements, big anti-racist movements, anti-colonial movements, student movements, but then struggled to cope with a period of defeat without battening down the hatches, breaking up branches, ossifying its analysis of the world in fear that they were operating in an environment that was inhospitable to Marxist ideas, and becoming suspicious of calls for renewal and for democracy. The problem which confronted the SWP, a problem which confronts organizations like it perennially, is if you want a revolution, how do you persist with the revolutionary project in times that are not revolutionary? Huge question. Today, the SWP is a shriveled image of its former self. And this doesn't just reflect in its size, it's fundamental to its mode of politics and its method of organizing. The organization's network of industrial militants is far smaller than it was when I was a member of it for 2 years, now 13 years ago. Outside of the workplace, it has a strictly mobilizational model of politics, which forsakes any deep one-to-one organizing for a predominantly reactive protest model, which expects the people to hear the call and meet the left where the left is at, rather than the other way around. And the scope for a renewal of practices and ideas in the organization, despite a recent apology over 10 years late for the horrid treatment of the women and the supporters, an apology that only happened because new student members found out what was going on and absolutely whipped the SWP into shape over it. The scope for renewal still is pretty much zilch for this organization. So the challenge for me is twofold. How do you build sustainable anti-capitalist organizations in a period of left social democratic growth that can endure and cope with defeat and marginalization? The central answers for me, and I want to explore this further, I don't think they're determined answers or determined solutions. You have to have a commitment to a lively democratic culture. You have to have a constant embrace of intellectual renewal, and you have to have a continued search for connection to working class life and struggle, even in periods of defeat where that becomes profoundly difficult. Unless you are an underground cell in a dictatorship, you always have some room for maneuver, and you never need to delve into the kinds of cultist behaviors which characterized the SWP when it was treating those women and the people that backed those women so awfully. The second thing for me is you have to try and avoid making a virtue out of necessity. The SWP, who once had a succinct critique of parts of the broader institutional apparatus, like the trade union bureaucracies, has now become totally dependent on these bureaucracies to sustain the campaigns they run. And in the case of Together, the coalition that I begun this hot take with at the top, just like Stand Up to Racism before it, another coalition of theirs, they can do good work and play a role, but they are not starting from the question of who is our people and what politics will it take to organize them. And so you end up with a Marxist organization that explicitly wants a workers' revolution to overthrow capitalism when you read their newspaper. But when you look at some of the work that the members are doing, it's the legwork for the most timid, liberal, and institutionalized form of politics possible. And I guess I'm trying to insist that there is room for anti-capitalist organizations that can be far better.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jonas. I think some really important lessons in that. And I think one thing that I want to draw out is the SWP's democratic centralism. So we've talked about democratic centralism before with regards to the PTB, Belgian Workers' Party. And I think it's also worth kind of drawing out here, because in the case of the PTB, democratic centralism is a bit of a boon, because, you know, in a particular context, it allows the organisation to really focus its messaging, focus its resources, focus its political capacities. Obviously, the problem here is the impact that that has then on the cadre, right? And so in the SWP's case, you know, you've got an organisation that puts its kind of political strategy increasingly in these coalitional front organizations, and increasingly away from the traditional workplace, the traditional, you know, sites of working class power. You combine that then with democratic centralism, where, you know, people's political training becomes primarily about discipline, towing the line, getting behind the leadership to operate as a single block. And you create, through political generations, people unused to challenge, unused to dissident and independent thinking, unused to breaking from the leadership's paradigms. And that's then compounded in the SWP's case by a leadership that, you know, forced a large group of its young people and a large group of its dissident thinkers out of the party in 2012, 2013, because of its mishandling of accusations and the reality of sexual violence. And, you know, those accusations that the SWP made of autonomism and movementism were obviously inaccurate, but they're also like a confession, because what the SWP was saying is these people are not towing the line. These people are thinking differently. These people are dissidents. In some ways, that was a confession. And so I think, take that as, you know, the kind of cadre that SWP is left with are people who's, you know, for years, decades, towing the line, not challenging the leadership, not breaking from the orthodoxies. And so you get to a period of retreat for the left, you know, a period where the right is insurgent, the right is making waves electorally, it's mobilizing on the streets. You know, we're not even talking about demonstrations now of thousands, we're talking about tens of thousands, veering into the hundreds of thousands of the far right on the streets. You know, as much as we like to say, you know, the Green Party is doing well, and I guess we can't talk about your party as, you know, this beacon of hope anymore. But certainly there was a moment that we did, and I think maybe we sometimes confused this for some kind of left insurgency when it really, really wasn't, and it isn't. And I think in many ways the left is still in retreat and is still in kind of this defensive position. And so the Together March, I think, is a product of that retreat, of that defensiveness. If we look at how it was put together, it isn't a campaign that is rooted in local working class organizations, grassroots organizations, trade union rank and file. It is a coalition of celebrities and a coalition of union bureaucrats, some of whom aren't even, leaders of trade unions anymore. It includes Labour politicians are towing what is quite a liberal political line on, we just need to kind of come together because of the inclusion of Labour politicians. It hasn't been so forceful in its critique of the Labour Party and, Keir Starmer's parroting of Enoch Powell's kind of language and iconography. And this is a strategy that's being supported by what an organization that calls itself like a revolutionary organization. And, just think about it. The Together coalition doesn't have local branches. It has no intention of setting up local branches. So it's not in any way orientated towards building working class power. And how it was planned and how it was put together is, we'll have some celebrities on a stage, we'll get people to sign a petition, and, we'll create a new mailing list that we can use to swell the SWP's ranks. But there's no sense of, how are we building working class power? And I think this is just this kind of strategy is so antithetical to the idea of like building revolutionary like working class power. And it's also a tried and tested formula. The People's Assembly, various different iterations of this failed strategy. And the kind of like SWP, not only are the cadre in the organization going along with it, but they're central to kind of pushing this. And it's like, Jesus Christ, we really are in a moment of defeat where we feel that just a bunch of celebrities saying we should all be together from a stage is revolutionary anti-racist strategy. And it's mind-boggling. And not only mind-boggling, it's just not what the moment demands at all. I think of, again, I don't want to romanticize, but I think of Cable Street. I think of the Asian youth worker movement. I think of these kind of key anti-fascist moments in history. Central to them were local grassroots organizing, local cells of power that come together nationally in their local areas to defend their local areas, working class roots, not just kind of A to B marches in London. And I feel like, it's just such a mark of the just position of defeat that we're in. And I think revolutionaries and radicals really need to get together and think of some new ways of doing shit.
Yeah, I mean, I was just really struck in my reading for this because, I was never a member of the SWP, nor any revolutionary party. Sorry, I just want to get that disclaimer in there. I was just reading for this, like, just how, at the time of Comrade Delta and at the time of the sexual assault scandal within the party 2013, just how many staff members the party had compared to its actual membership. So according to David Renton's figures, who's written a lot about the SWP and is a former member of the SWP, 2013 they had 80 staff members. I don't know if they were full time, but 80 staff members, 80 to 2,500 members. So just to put this into context, at the height of Momentum, not that Momentum's a revolutionary organisation, but just as a point of comparison, at the height of Momentum, when we had around 35,000 members, I think we had 15 to 20 staff members, something like that. So it's just we had more than 10 times the number of members, and yet less than a quarter of the staff. And I think this speaks to an organisation that has raised a lot of money over the years, I assume through legacies, so people dying and leaving a lot of money to the organisation in their will, and probably through the purchase of property, I would have thought. I know other kind of like small Trotskyist organisations persist through that. But you have then almost this kind of like zombie organisation where it's very bureaucratic and it's actually very staff run and dominated compared to its members. And I found that very shocking because obviously a lot of people say like, well, like when I'm organising outside of London, outside of the big cities, the only people that turn up are the SWP. And I definitely believe people when they say that, but it does raise the question to me, how many of those people are turning up actually paid by the party to do so rather than actually a kind of a member volunteering their time. I'm not saying that happens in every instance. And it just, like listening to you guys talk about this, it does feel like the central question here is that just like what, like if not the organizational form and culture and strategy of the SWP, what are the organizational forms and cultures and strategies that revolutionaries need to pursue now? Because I think what happens by default is that people with politics that are more radical than the left of Labour or the left of the Greens end up being just pretty disorganized, and some of us just end up folding into electoral projects which often exist, I would argue charitably exist at the boundary between social democratic and socialist, depending on how you interpret the strategy and depending on how you interpret the various policy proposals. That doesn't seem sufficient to me. Like that doesn't seem like a good enough answer to like what should revolutionaries be doing now. So I suppose that's the question that I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on and to bounce back to you.
Yeah, I mean, just immediately on that question of organisers, like I have a lot of friends, right, who were paid members of the SWP back before they left over the rape and sexual harassment cases, and there it's definitely, there's this kind of old term that gets thrown up in these circles of substituting for a broader membership, and it's nowhere near as bad as it is now because the resource capacity of the SWP is much worse now today than it was 13 years ago, for example. But it's also just a case that like At that point, at least, you'd have an organizer in different bits of the country, or you'd have student organizers, or you'd have people that work the paper, or you'd have full-timers in some other thing. They'd be paid a pittance, like, at real pittance, like lots of them would also go on benefits at the same time. When we're talking post-Cameron Clegg coalition, right? So we're talking post-reforms on welfare. And, to be fair, at that point, like you could say that like the branch structures of the organization weren't as weak as they are now, right? So like I was in East London, for example, and you'd have an active branch. You could go do a paper sale on a Saturday with 6 or 7 other people. You'd have a branch meeting on a Wednesday that would have 10, maybe 15, on a good day, maybe 20 people. And that's not even to mention your student group down the road, you know what I mean? Where you have anything from 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 people who are active, right? The question was always like this kind of, this massive reproduction of people who weren't meaningfully onboarded or caterized, who didn't like the kind of command politics of the SWP, rightfully so, because it was incredibly undemocratic, and would be members, participate for 6 months, get burned out, and then massively drop out, right? So there was no real sustainability to the organization, which is a challenge, right? I guess it's really funny, like, Shanice, when you were talking about this kind of suspicion of members, right? And those accusations of autonomism and movementism in 13 years ago. It's funny because like Tony Cliff, who was the founder of the SWP, actually back then it was called the Socialist Review Group when he founded it in the 50s. So it's been around for a long while, this organization. He died long before me and Shanice were even members of the SWP, let alone before we resigned for it. He had a quote that I picked up in an article called "The Organized Distrust of the Members by the Centre." to give you a kind of flavor of like some of the kind of troublesome politics. And I was thinking, like, I was reading through some old documents of the SWP during the time of the crisis, right, in 2013, and like they talked about how the opposition had lost all hope in the working class. They thought the working class had become broken and fragmented. And it's kind of ironic now because I've just read a book called The Breaking of the English Working Class. Maybe they were right, but they weren't. It's a bit deeper than that. But I guess on this like question of Together, which I think is super, super important, Together March, I just find it super underwhelming more than anything else. In no small part, because it's a much more futile repetition of Stand Up to Racism, like you say, without any local grassroots infrastructure and without any meaningful plan with what happens after this march by the looks of things. And I'm just like, you've got all of these celebrities on there. You've got Paloma Faith on there. You've got Fontaine's DC. You've got a bunch of people on there. But where's the counterculture?
Yeah.
There's a wealth of counterculture out there at the moment, whether it's like Kneecap or Bob Villain or whatever
Exactly.
it is. And there's no meaningful attempt to tap into that vibe, that affect, that mood. And I have a general problem with the broader politics of like, I think increasingly, like I do get it. Like I'm really sympathetic to like the anti-Nazi League. You exceptionalize the far right because they are a distinct threat to racialized working class communities in the country, and you target them and you batter them basically, and you build mass protests against them wherever they march. I'm very sympathetic to that, but I think there's a danger in exceptionalizing the far right that you miss the kind of dynamic of violence, that reciprocal violence that exists between the far right and the state, the racist state. And in America, where there is a tradition of, understanding racial fascism, George Jackson talks about this, Angela Davis talks about this as something that's deeply embedded in the history and traditions of the state. You don't make that mistake. You fight the far right on the street and you fight the racist state. And I think we lost that. And the Together March is a massive example of that being lost, or not even necessarily, or being marginalized, because there were traditions that were doing that, right? Like the Black Panther Party, like the Race Today, like there were plenty of organizations and movements in Britain that were doing that, but this particular wing of the left and radical politics wasn't. But this particular wing of the left and radical politics dominates anti-fascism and anti-racism in this country still to this day. And for all of the respect that I have for the people that I know that plug away at it, SWP members and not SWP members who plug away at these coalitions, Stand Up to Racism Together, it's kind of futile if you don't have this more. If you're not trying to relate your anti-racism and your anti-fascism to people's animosity and their hatred and their sense of loss, as we talked about in the last episode. If you're just trying to relate it to a narrow anti-fascism, I think that has diminishing returns if it's not connected to a broader opposition to state racism, effectively.
Yeah, I think what you describe in the sense of that exceptionalization, and the thing is, I do, again, this is me thinking out loud, but I do wonder if that is a strategy that is fit for the current context.
Yes, not. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not convinced it is, because, I mean, first of all, there is a clear seam that runs from the Labour Party to the far right. The flirtation with Enoch Powell and the kind of language of the rivers of blood speech, but also just the really brutal immigration policies that they're bringing in to try and kind of undercut the worst excesses of the far right. But they're bringing in a wave of policies that are kind of more brutal, more racist, more exclusionary, more, barbaric than we've seen from the Tories and then we saw from, kind of the Blair era. So there's that kind of like, mainstreaming of the far right that doesn't quite fit itself into a tactic of kind of exceptionalizing their narrative. There's that. And then there's also just how far the Overton window has shifted. Back when we were fighting against kind of Nick Griffin, and I remember when he appeared on Question Time, how big it was that the guy was on Question Time, like how exceptional it was that he was allowed to be on there, and the kind of liberal establishment was like, whoa, this is a bit much, Nick Griffin, like, whoa. And there was a lot of ruckus about it, and it was a big thing that he had that mainstream platform. And now we can't get enough of far-right politicians being platformed on every corner and every inch of the mainstream media. I think of the notion of mass deportations. Not only is mass deportations now on the political agenda, not only is it acceptable and palatable to talk about mass deportations, it's even palatable to talk about mass deportations of legal migrants and people who just happen to be black and brown. This is the political context that we're operating in, where there isn't anymore this moral squeamishness that we can rely on that works really well with this exceptionalizing of the far right. Like, there aren't these liberal sentimentalities that exist anymore that we can just rest on. And the fact is, the idea of, oh yeah, let's just all come together, and you getting some kind of celebrities to kind of like push that narrative fits into far right narratives around these kind of liberal elites telling us how to think and what our politics should be, and sitting on their high horses, the very people who aren't going to be affected by the cost of living crisis, the very people who are going to be cushioned and protected from the worst excesses of what's going on in society and the poly crisis, telling us what our ethics and telling us what our politics and telling us what our identity should be. And it's like, there's a part of me that also maybe needs to be a bit humble, because I've been part of direct action groups where we've, for example, we have influence and we have status, and so we do these really cool direct actions where we try and force our way into the media to try and change the narrative, but that is a substitute for actually building power from below. I've been part of groups that do that, so I sympathize. There's a part of me that gets the impulse to substitute power for influence and class power for narrative, but it's ultimately a losing strategy, because if you look at what the far right are doing, their ability to mobilize, all they have to do is put a message in a Telegram group, and they've got people in that town and that city and that village who are able to mobilize. And that's a really scary thought. We used to have a bulwark against that. We used to have organizing that could resist that. And we no longer have that. We're fighting on the level of narrative and influence, and not on the level of street power and kind of street resistance and kind of local resistance. And there are exceptions to that. There are grassroots groups that are doing that work, But I look at the Together March and I'm like, rah, we are so far from where we need to be. And also, intellectually, we are so far from the thinking that we need to do, because the strategies that worked against Nick Griffin aren't fit, I think, for the current context.
Is the response to that, though, playing the devil's advocate with SWP, isn't the response to that like we're in lots of places across the country where we would want to build a base and we would want to have activists doing stuff, especially outside of cities. The SWP are often the only people, or some of the only people, active there. And might they claim that, like, even though they're far smaller than they were and they don't have the power that they once had, they do actually have people in lots of towns across the country that other groups just don't have?
Yeah, that's true. But ultimately, what we need is like mass power, right? And there's no group, the SWP or direct action groups, there's no group that is close to successfully building that kind of the kind of character of class power that we need to actually meaningfully resist the far right. So, they've got people, but they haven't got the strategy.
Yeah, for sure. And I do like, I thought Jonas's kind of like 3 criteria that set out earlier in criticizing the SWP of like, you need an organization that is able to undergo intellectual renewal, has like a democratic culture, and is actually like connected into the class in like a meaningful way. Actually a really good way of thinking about, well, okay, what kind of like far left or revolutionary organization do we need? Like it needs to be one that, fulfills those 3 criteria, right? And it felt like an interesting case study or an interesting exercise in my head to think about, like, well, in what ways did the Labour Party, in what ways does the Green Party satisfy those criteria? And some of them they do, and some of them they don't. I suppose the criticism of like, well, we don't have the space, and we're moving towards, or we've moved towards this kind of attentional form of politics, and as you say, this politics of influence and persuasion rather than power building. I suppose it's just one that we can level at the SWP for sure, but it feels like we can equally level it at lots of other parts of the movement and the
Definitely.
left, and most obviously at like the liberal left in the climate movement with Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and stuff, which were 100% at like attentional organisations rooted around that kind of political action.
Yeah, there's so much here. Look, I mean, I'll just be completely honest. Like I live in one of those places where, like, when it comes to the far right, it's the SWP members in their coalitions and with their allies who put out the call and will have an opposition to the far right. I'm really happy that exists. It's not the summit of where I think anti-racist and anti-fascist strategy should be, but would be weaker if it didn't exist. But it's also a bit of an issue, right? At the same time, which is that it means that activists who have this kind of command of politics and execute the commands of the politics that come from the center, which is the kind of anti-racism and anti-fascism that we've talked about on the podcast today, with all of its limitations, leaves very little space for a new type of anti-racism or anti-fascism for people to do if, for example, there is a critical mass enough of people in those localities to carry that out. And so that's a bit of a catch-22 for us, I think, in a lot of places that I find difficult to work through. One qualification I would just say to what you said, Shanice, is that I do agree. Like, I totally agree that the scales have shifted on far right strength now, and in lots of places in the country, the far right can be stronger in street mobilizations than the left and anti-racist. But I would caveat just with that moment in 2024, right, where you had these pogroms that violently tore through lots of working class communities across the country. But the response to it was incredible, to be fair. Like the kind of mass anti-racist mobilizations that came as a response were just phenomenal and great and something to be celebrated, and a regular instance that you get in British politics of mass mobilization or on questions of racism that shouldn't be sniffed at, and I'm not suggesting you were. But the problem with the kind of current mode of anti-racist politics is there's no attempt to institutionalize or radicalize that in any meaningful way, right? So you get that mass response in 2024 to the far right riots, and then what do you do with it? Usually you have a demonstration with 15 to 20 speakers, people get bored, they dwindle off. Do you know what I mean? And then that's it. Do you know what I mean? What happens to those people? What happens to that mood? On Joe's a big question, I mean, I've tried to poke the bear on this on the podcast over the last few episodes. I think is in the wake of the Your Party crash. I think it's quite a central question, right? What organizations do we need to build? And I guess for me, like I'm a member of revolutionary socialism in the 21st century. I've talked about that before. Like, it's an organization with a really rich culture and is trying to find its way through the current muddle of politics, and I think is doing better than most organizations on the far left, and I think will be a really key part of whatever happens in the future of the radical left, frankly. But I do think, to my mind, we need anti-capitalist organizations that are kind of transitional in character, particularly after the demise of Your Party and with the Green Party winning that kind of race, if you like, between Your Party and the Greens. I think we need organizations that are heavily focused on deep organizing, that are trying to renew the space for transitional politics, who are politics that will get you from where we are now to a much more radical form that might not necessarily be full communism, but are explicitly anti-capitalist and like we kind of talked about last episode with LFE, don't budge on central questions and are absolutely resilient, that tries to stand candidates in some places where they see particular openings, even though the focus is organizing and the realization that that's a long-term project and we have to move away from the kind of reactive mobilizational model of organizations like the SWP. And it's genuinely trying to think quite carefully both about renewing left strategy at the kind of molecular level of organizing, but also at the kind of bigger picture level of what the fuck is going on with the world on the one hand, but also in the early 20th century, when you had the demise of, not the demise, but when you had the collapse of the Second International and you had the rise of the Communist International and you had revolutions in Russia and Hungary and the Red Years in Italy and big revolts elsewhere, including in the global south, there was a revitalization of the radical project. The conduits of what the radical project would look like shifted, because possibilities opened. And I think we need forms of organization that are able to reckon with that, are able to reckon with how you articulate a new radical politics for this moment. Because I'm just struck that, like, anti-capitalists have so few answers to the big structural and fiscal problems of the day that, like, in lots of ways, the answers of the SWP wouldn't be that much different to the answers in practice of, like, Zack Polanski. You could say propagandistically you want workers' revolution and Soviets, like workers' councils, but like practically you're arguing for a wealth tax and other forms of demands that are like quite similar to the main institutional vector on the left. We need something that connects the two. And I know I argue this every episode almost, but like I think that's where the focus needs to be. Because there isn't the space for mass communist politics right now. That much is for sure. Part of this conversation, the thing I talked about, how do you build revolutionary organizations in moments that aren't revolutionary? Maybe you build something just a little bit different than an explicitly revolutionary organization.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I just guess my final point is to contradict something that I said earlier, because, we all want to build something mass. And
Yeah.
I often overuse that word, and I'm like, well, we just need to build like something mass. We just need loads of people behind us, and yeah, we do.
Big.
Yeah, we need it to be big, tremendous. It's gotta be big.
Huge.
It's gotta be huge. But actually, we are in a moment of retreat. We are in a defensive position. We are in, I guess, what Tony Cliff would have called a downturn. And, in these moments, questions of caderization, intellectual renewal, how do you sustain intellectual creativity in kind of moments where things feel less possible, and that kind of deep organizing you described, Jonas, where we get to know our neighbors. We do the slow plodding work of fighting for local small wins, but that slowly build people's confidence and build the networks that you have around you and build the trust that people have in you locally. I think one thing that's maybe missing from the conversation, though, is although it might not be the time to build a mass revolutionary party or organization, I do think revolutionaries and anti-capitalists and radicals need to network much better, need to consolidate. our organising and capacities and resources, our thinking, our ideas, and also just sociality. You know, I remember back in the student movement how a lot of the things that I learned wasn't through reading, although, you know, some of it was, but was through just hanging out with comrades, like just chilling, just like, you know, going to a picket line together at 8 o'clock in the morning and going to catch lunch or, you know, go to the pub afterwards. And, you know, I guess part of the problem is as you get older, the structural things like work and social reproduction commitments, if you've got kids, if you've got caring responsibilities, these things get in the way. But actually, you know, if we bring things back to the local, if we bring things back to that deep organising, sociality, politics and social reproduction should connect. And I think, you know, how can we find ways of organising that are slow, that are deep, that start to connect our lives in more fundamental ways? Maybe that's the work that we need to be focusing on instead of how do we build the next biggest thing?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that to a certain extent, but I think there's two intersecting modalities there, which is like, I think we need people to be doing the spade work, as it were, and that deep organising work. And the timeline on that is long, and the pace of that is slow. But I think quite quickly we need some kind of organisation to bring all of the left-wing and revolutionary people who are doing that together to create that sociality and to create those networks of support, and to basically just give all of those people a home. And I think, you know, your party there was a lot of hopes that your party would be that. There was a lot of hopes that maybe a faction like Organising for Popular Power within your party could be like the real locus of that. And it, I don't know, it just feels to me that there is a space for another left-wing organisation, or there is a space to build something like RS21 into being something that is bigger. Because it just feels like there's a lot of people out there that desire something like this, but no one's quite worked out how to make it pop.
Next episode, let's have it.
Let's make it pop.
We've got to make it pop at some point.
I really think someone should just call a conference at some point, and serious people should hash out these serious questions. You know, that's personally. It's just like, lastly, like that thing that Shanice said, I'm really sympathetic to. When I was in the SWP, you know, I had one good year where I was like this young before everything kicked off and you realised all of this horrible stuff. Where I was a young radical, met all these older radicals, learned loads of them. You know, you'd go to a branch meeting, you talk about some random shit, like you talk about the Spanish Civil War, or you talk about like what does austerity mean? And you know what I mean? Like you talk about random stuff, but it was deeply educational because you were in a room with people who had spent their lives organising and building politics, and despite the undemocratic culture of the organisation, incredibly sharp because they'd struggled and fought for so long. And then you go to the pub and you'd ask them loads of mad questions in the pub, and you'd kind of throw loads of kind of your loony kind of young ultra left ideas at them, and they'd tell you how you're wrong, and more often than not they'd probably be right. When I was like 19 or 20, and you need a vehicle and a culture like that, as opposed to the vehicle and the culture that the SWP was when everything kicked off and shit hit the fan and people realized that there was actually something dark underneath all that we experienced and witnessed.
Yeah, man. Just on that note, big up Cheryl Yanowitz, who was one of my old comrades. That like proper mentor. She was Jewish communist, although I don't think she would have described herself that way. Certainly the communist part. But she was, you know, in the Black Power movement. She was feminist radical back in the 60s and 70s. And this is someone I used to sit in the pub with and have it out with. And she always used to tell me I was wrong. And it was brilliant. And like we learned and we collaborated. And I taught her some things and she taught me many things. And yeah, those were the days.
Those were the days.
The best of times, the worst of times.
The best of times, the worst of times. I mean, I do just think the point on intergenerational organising is so important, and it's one of the things that I actually loved about Corbynism was the intergenerational and national character of it. Yeah, and I really do miss that. Yeah, I could really miss that. All right. Thanks so much for that, guys. Now we move on to our final section, which is the reading for this week. And this is where we talk about something that we've read or listened to over the last 2 weeks that we think you guys should listen to too. Jonas, what have you got for us this week?
I'm just finishing reading, this is really nerdy. I just finished reading John Maynard Keynes' General Theory alongside an incredibly useful companion written by a guy called Jeff Mann. Basically, I'm trying to get a...
Nerd. Dork.
You're really not wrong, honestly. My life choices are quite interesting sometimes. Or maybe they're not, actually. Maybe that's the point. I'm trying to get a better grasp, basically, of political economy at the moment. Really important, because this is a kind of historical period when this thing we call the economy, it's just becoming more politicized than ever before in my lifetime.
Yeah.
If you ever have the time and energy to deep dive into Keynes' General Theory, I really, really recommend it. It's a dense read, and I'm by no means a Keynesian, but it gives you such a profound sense of the economy as a political technology which structures and mobilizes and organizes populations. And, it also helps you kind of understand how out of kilter our current world is with the kind of exceptional period of the post-war economic boom in the 40s, which the by then dead Keynes had such a huge impact upon. And for me, it kind of poses this question of like what a distinctly communist technology of governance would look like, an area that both left theory and experience feels quite ill-equipped to deal with.
Yeah, my reading is the Red Mole Substack written by Duncan Chappell. And I've chosen to go for this because it's been a while since I've kind of read the inner mental workings of the British revolutionary left. And there's something about reading that Substack that is both nostalgic, but also I think some of his analysis is helpful. And I think it's good to engage with kind of, whilst we are really in the swing of these electoral projects and, really thinking about the Green Party and your party, to also look to other traditions of politics in Britain and kind of be grounded in different traditions. So, yeah, check that out. I'm not saying I agree with absolutely everything, but I think just more in terms of diversity of thinking and thought, yeah, I'd check out Red Mole Substack.
Nice.
Okay, and mine for this week are a couple of podcasts that David Renton has done on his forthcoming book, Comrade Delta, which is, a book on the 2013 crisis in the SWP. And I'll link specific podcasts in the notes, but he's just, another former SWP member, seemingly a deep expert on the party, and just speaks on it in an incredibly engaging and I found kind of like illuminating way. And, I cited the fact of like all of the staff members and stuff earlier, but he just has some kind of like very like precise examples and insights from the party, which, I found like really, really interesting. So yeah, that'd be my reading for this week. Thank you so much for that, guys. If you guys enjoyed the show as much as I did, you can support us at lifeoftheparty.uk/support. Otherwise, we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Peace.
This is an Ampersounds production.